My name is Ezekiel Thorne, hydroponics engineer from Chicago. 30 days ago, Yellowstone erupted, blocking the sun and plunging us into a volcanic winter apocalypse. The temperature dropped below freezing. Society collapsed. Now I'm trapped with desperate neighbors, dwindling supplies, and raiders watching our building. My knowledge of growing food without sunlight keeps us alive, but every day brings new threats. This is how we survived the first month when darkness fell. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I remember exactly where I was when the world ended. In the basement of my Chicago apartment building, tinkering with my latest hydroponic prototype. The tremors started so subtly that I mistook them for the usual vibrations from the L train that runs a few blocks away. It wasn't until my phone erupted with alerts that I realized something was terribly wrong. Yellowstone had erupted. Not just any eruption, but what scientists would later call a VEI-7 event. One of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. I'm Ezekiel Thorne. Before all this, I designed hydroponic systems for urban environments. My job took me to disaster zones around the world, implementing emergency food production when traditional agriculture failed. I never imagined my own country would become my next deployment zone. The initial reports downplayed the severity. Experts on the news predicted some climate disruption, perhaps a few weeks of cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets. But I'd studied enough disaster scenarios to know better. The amount of ash being reported would mean significant global cooling. I immediately abandoned my work and headed to the nearest stores. By the time I reached the first supermarket, the shelves were already thinning. Not empty yet. Most people still believed this would blow over in a few days. I filled 2 carts with non-perishables, seeds, fertilizers, and growing supplies. The cashier joked that I must be planning for doomsday. I didn't have the heart to tell her how right she was. Day 2 brought the first snowfall. In July. Chicago is no stranger to extreme weather, but snow in the middle of summer sent people into a panic. By afternoon, the grocery stores were war zones. I witnessed 2 men come to blows over the last package of batteries. A woman wept in the empty canned goods aisle, clutching her children close. The sky had taken on an eerie, yellowish-gray tint that made everything look sickly and wrong. I made 3 more supply runs that day, focusing on tools, medical supplies, and additional growing equipment. The ash was already starting to accumulate on cars and sidewalks, fine, gritty particles that got into everything. The seeds I'd been collecting from disaster zones around the world now seemed like the most valuable things I owned. By day 3, the power was flickering. Internet connectivity became spotty as servers went down or backup generators failed. I managed one last video call with a colleague in Japan who described similar conditions there. The ash cloud is circling the globe, she told me before the connection died. The models were wrong. This isn't going to clear up in weeks. We're looking at months, maybe years. That's when I decided to convert our building's basement into a survival space. The landlord had abandoned the property months earlier during the economic downturn, so there was no one to stop me from taking over. The basement was perfect, insulated, secure, with access to the building's central water system. It was while setting up additional growing lights that I met Mrs. Abernathy from apartment 4B. She'd come down to check her storage unit and found me instead, rewiring the basement's electrical panel. Instead of reporting me, she revealed she was a retired botanist. "Those lights aren't positioned optimally for photosynthesis," were her first words to me. She became my first ally. By day 4, the power grid failed completely. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and the skies were now permanently dark with ash. I was grateful for my foresight in purchasing solar panels and batteries. They wouldn't power the entire building, but they would keep the hydroponic system running. Violence erupted on the streets as desperation set in. I watched from my window as a group of men broke into the convenience store across the street. The police showed up but seemed overwhelmed and departed after a half-hearted attempt to restore order. That night, I heard gunshots for the first time. Day 5 brought a critical decision. Several of my neighbors had noticed my trips carrying supplies to the basement. A family with 2 young children knocked on my door, asking if I had any food to spare. Their desperation was obvious. I had to decide right then whether to remain alone with my resources or build a community. I chose community, but selectively. I invited the family, Mrs. Abernathy, and a former military medic from the 3rd floor named Ray. I explained what I was building in the basement and established clear rules. Everyone contributes, everyone works, and no one jeopardizes the group. We began moving essential items from their apartments that night. By day 6, temperatures inside the building had fallen below freezing. Pipes burst on the upper floors, creating ice cascades down the stairwells. We consolidated in the basement, which stayed somewhat warmer due to its underground position and the heat generated by my growing lights. The city outside had gone completely dark. That evening, while checking the building's perimeter, I spotted shadowy figures watching from across the street. They stood motionless in the snow for nearly an hour before disappearing into the darkness. I didn't tell the others, but I reinforced the basement door that night and positioned tools that could serve as weapons within easy reach. I had no way of knowing then that those watchers would return with friends and guns. The first week established our new normal: complete power and communications blackout across the city. I focused on expanding the hydroponic system, utilizing every available container. We scavenged plastic bottles, buckets, even old bathtubs to create growing space. Mrs. Abernathy proved invaluable, her botanical knowledge complementing my technical skills. I established work rotations quickly. We needed every minute of productivity to survive. Ray's military background made him perfect for security. The family, the Carters, took shifts, monitoring our power usage and tending the plants. Mr. Carter had been a plumber, which proved invaluable when we needed to redirect water from the building's damaged system. Our hydroponic setup was crude compared to my previous work, but functional. I used a nutrient film technique for leafy greens, where a shallow stream of nutrient-rich water flows over the roots. For larger plants, I implemented a deep water culture system using plastic storage bins. Without proper grow lights, I positioned everything to maximize exposure to our limited power supply, creating a staggered lighting schedule that kept the plants growing while conserving energy. The first challenge was water. When the building's main pipes froze and burst, we lost our primary supply. Mrs. Abernathy suggested collecting snow and melting it, which solved our immediate problem. We set up collection points at each window using plastic sheeting to funnel snow into containers. The ash mixed with the snow concerned me, so I designed a simple filtration system using charcoal, sand, and cloth. On day 8, we harvested our first microgreens: radish, sprouts, and sunflower shoots. The portion was tiny, just a few handfuls, but the psychological impact was immense. I will never forget the look on the Carter children's faces when they tasted fresh food after a week of canned goods. Even Mrs. Abernathy shed tears. It was a moment of hope in the darkness. That night, we faced our first security threat. 3 men attempted to break in through the building's main entrance. Ray and I confronted them armed with a baseball bat and pipe wrench. They retreated when they realized we were organized, but their desperation was evident. They were thin, hollow-eyed from hunger. One of them begged us to at least take his 10-year-old daughter. "She will die out there," he said. We refused to separate the family but invited them all to join us under our established rules. They declined, unwilling to share their own meager supplies. I still wonder if we made the right choice. By day 9, I knew we needed to expand our operation. Our food supplies wouldn't last until the hydroponic system reached full production. We organized our first expedition to search neighboring apartments in our building. Many residents had fled to relatives in other states when the eruption first happened, leaving behind valuable resources. The Carter's 10-year-old son, Max, proved surprisingly adept at slipping through small spaces. He could wriggle through partially blocked hallways that adults couldn't navigate. Together, we salvaged canned food, medicines, clothing, and, most importantly, seeds from one resident's hobby garden. I also recovered a small library of gardening books from apartment 5C, which included information on growing in low-light conditions. Day 10 brought a significant breakthrough. I discovered the building superintendent's tool cache. Among the hardware was a set of rechargeable power tools with batteries. I modified the batteries to power additional growing lights, nearly doubling our cultivation capacity. We also found the superintendent's keys, giving us access to previously locked areas. We explored the stairwells, finding they had enough ambient light from high windows to support some plant growth. I set up vertical growing systems using plastic bottles attached to the walls. Mrs. Abernathy suggested cold-tolerant crops like kale and spinach for these areas. The temperature continued to drop outside. The news had mentioned volcanic winter before communications failed, but I don't think any of us grasped what that truly meant. Inside our basement sanctuary, the combined heat from our bodies, the growing lights, and our makeshift stove kept the temperature bearable. Upstairs was another story. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and hallways became freezing wind tunnels. By day 11, we faced our first major crisis. Our nutrient solution for the hydroponics system was running critically low. Without it, the plants would starve regardless of light or water. I needed to improvise. Mrs. Abernathy suggested using diluted urine as nitrogen source. An old gardener's trick, she called it. Combined with crushed eggshells for calcium and wood ash for potassium, we created a makeshift nutrient solution. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep the plants alive. That day, I also noticed Mrs. Abernathy's cough. The cold, combined with the fine ash that permeated everything, was taking a toll on her lungs. At 76, she was our most vulnerable member. We moved her sleeping area closer to our heat source and began boiling water regularly to increase humidity. Day 12 brought the need for a more substantial supply run. Our medicine cabinet was nearly empty, and Mrs. Abernathy's condition wasn't improving. Ray and I prepared for an expedition to a pharmacy 3 blocks away. I hesitated to leave our hydroponic system unattended, but Mrs. Carter had proven herself a quick study. We armed ourselves with makeshift weapons and ventured out. The city was transformed. Snow and ash created grayscale drifts that buried cars and obscured street signs. The cold was biting, penetrating our layered clothing within minutes. We moved quickly, aware that exposure could kill us faster than any human threat. At the pharmacy, we discovered we weren't the first to arrive. A group of 5 survivors had claimed the building. When they spotted us, tension immediately filled the air. Their leader, a woman with a hunting rifle, demanded to know what we wanted. I explained about Mrs. Abernathy, emphasizing her botanical knowledge that could help all of us survive. To my surprise, the woman lowered her weapon. "You're growing food?" she asked. I nodded, carefully describing our hydroponic system without revealing its location. This transformed the encounter from confrontation to negotiation. They had medicines but were running out of food. We established a cautious trade agreement. Antibiotics for Mrs. Abernathy in exchange for fresh greens once our next crop matured. As we returned to our building, Ray pointed out something disturbing. Organized patrols moving through the streets several blocks away. They moved with purpose, systematically entering buildings and emerging with supplies. "Those aren't desperate families," Ray muttered. "They're raiders." The knowledge I gained in disaster zones told me we needed to prepare for something worse than cold and hunger. When we returned with the antibiotics, Mrs. Abernathy's relief was visible. As she took her first dose, I began planning defensive measures. The pharmacy group had given us valuable intelligence along with the medicine. Reports of coordinated gangs stripping neighborhoods of resources and taking captives for unknown purposes. By day 13, Mrs. Abernathy's breathing improved slightly, but our collective anxiety increased. We began reinforcing the basement entrance and creating escape routes. Max discovered a maintenance tunnel that connected to the neighboring building's basement. It was too small for adults to navigate comfortably, but could serve as an emergency exit for the children. That night, as I monitored our power system, I caught myself tracing the scars on my right hand, burn marks from a laboratory fire years before. Disasters had shaped my life long before Yellowstone erupted. Perhaps that's why I was prepared when others weren't. I wondered if some part of me had always been waiting for the world to end. By day 14, tensions within our small community began to surface. The Carters' teenage daughter, Emily, confronted me during the morning meal. "Why are we giving food to those people at the pharmacy? We barely have enough for ourselves." Others nodded in agreement. It was the first open challenge to my decisions. I explained that alliances would be crucial for long-term survival. The pharmacy group had medical supplies we needed, and sharing food created goodwill that might protect us later. Ray backed me up, but I could tell not everyone was convinced. The conversation shifted to whether we should accept more survivors into our group. "Every new person is another mouth to feed," Mr. Carter argued. "But also another pair of hands to work," countered Mrs. Abernathy. The debate became heated until I finally stepped in. "We'll evaluate new people case by case," I decided. "Skills, supplies, and trustworthiness will all factor in. We can't save everyone, but isolation isn't the answer either." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave us a framework. Still, the tension lingered. That afternoon, I noticed our supply of dried beans was lower than it should have been. The discrepancy was small enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been meticulously tracking our inventory. Someone was taking extra food. I kept this discovery to myself, but began taking note of everyone's movements. That evening, I pretended to sleep but watched through slitted eyes. Around midnight, Emily Carter slipped from her family's sleeping area and moved to our storage section. She quickly pocketed several protein bars before returning to bed. The next morning, I asked Emily to help me with the hydroponics system, separating her from the others. When we were alone, I confronted her about the stolen food. She broke down immediately, revealing a cache hidden in an air duct, enough food to last one person about a week. "I need an escape plan," she sobbed. "When the food runs out, when something goes wrong, I need to know I can survive." Her fear was rational. She was 16 and had watched the world collapse around her. I understood her impulse to create a personal safety net. Rather than punishing her, I offered a compromise. She could keep a small emergency pack, but it would be known to the group and counted as part of our inventory. In exchange, she would take on additional responsibilities, including teaching the younger children. The solution transformed her from a risk into an asset. That incident made me realize we needed better structure and transparency. I gathered everyone that evening and laid out a more formal system for resource distribution and decision-making. We created a council where each adult had a voice, established clear rules about food allocation, and implemented a skill-sharing program. The system wasn't perfect, but it eased tensions. By day 16, We decided to expand our territory to include the first floor of the apartment building. The basement was becoming cramped, and we needed more growing space. The expedition was risky. The upper floors were freezing, with temperatures well below zero, and exposure for too long could be fatal. Ray, Mr. Carter, and I bundled up in multiple layers and moved cautiously upstairs. The stairwell was treacherous with ice, and the first-floor hallway was eerie in its abandonment. Personal items lay scattered about: a child's toy, a dropped grocery bag, family photos still hanging on apartment walls. Silent witnesses to the hasty evacuations. We systematically checked each apartment, finding more supplies and useful items. In one C, we discovered an elderly resident who had died in his sleep, likely from hypothermia in the early days after the power failed. We respectfully covered him with a blanket, took what supplies would help us survive, and closed the door. There was no way to properly bury him in the frozen ground outside. Apartment 1F yielded our most valuable find: a collection of camping equipment including a propane heater with several fuel canisters. This would allow us to expand our living area significantly. We also found fishing gear which seemed useless until Ray pointed out it included line and hooks that could be repurposed for security alarms. We cleared 3 apartments to create a connected space on the first floor. One would serve as additional growing space, utilizing the natural light from windows despite the darkened sky. Another became a food preparation area, and the third a common space that wasn't as cramped as our basement headquarters. The expansion boosted morale considerably. Having room to move about without constantly brushing against each other was a luxury we hadn't realized we missed. Mrs. Abernathy took charge of the new growing area, showing remarkable energy despite her age and recent illness. She taught Emily and Max how to identify plant diseases and cross-pollinate by hand when necessary. On day 17, I had my first real moment of despair. While checking our power system, I realized one of the solar batteries was degrading faster than expected. Without it, we would lose at least a third of our growing capacity. I found myself alone in the storage room, surrounded by our dwindling supplies, overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping everyone alive. For nearly an hour, I sat in silence, contemplating the fragility of our situation. Everything we had built could collapse from a single point of failure: a broken battery, a serious illness, a determined attack. The world we had known was gone, and there was no guarantee we could build something enduring in its place. It was Mrs. Abernathy who found me there. She didn't ask questions, just sat beside me and began sorting seeds. "My husband served in Vietnam," she said after a while. "He told me that in the worst moments, you don't focus on survival. You focus on creating something worth surviving for." She handed me a seed packet. "Strawberries. They'll need special care, but imagine the children's faces when they taste them." That simple moment realigned my thinking. We weren't just surviving, we were rebuilding. I returned to the group with new determination and a plan to reconfigure our power system to distribute the load more efficiently. Day 18 brought troubling news. Ray and Emily, while checking our building's perimeter, spotted a group of organized raiders systematically working through buildings 2 blocks away. Unlike the desperate individuals we'd encountered before, these people moved with military precision. They posted guards, maintained communications, and thoroughly stripped each building they entered. "They're working their way in this direction," Ray reported. "I'd say we have 2 days, maybe 3, before they reach us." We immediately began preparations. I moved our most essential hydroponics equipment to the basement maintenance tunnel Max had discovered. We created hidden caches of food and supplies throughout the building in case we needed to abandon our main area quickly. Ray set up tripwires connected to noisemakers at key entry points and trained everyone on escape routes. The next day, Mrs. Abernathy's health took another downturn. Her breathing became labored and she developed a fever. The antibiotics from the pharmacy were helping, but not enough. We needed stronger medication. "There's a hospital 4 blocks east," Ray said. "Dangerous, but they might have what we need." The decision to attempt a hospital run was difficult. It meant dividing our forces at a time when the raider threat was growing. But Mrs. Abernathy's botanical knowledge was essential to our food production. More importantly, she had become the heart of our group. We couldn't lose her. Ray and I prepared for the expedition, arming ourselves as best we could. Emily, surprisingly, volunteered to join us. "I know what medications to look for," she explained. "My mother was a pharmacy technician before becoming a stay-at-home mom." As we geared up to leave, I saw dark smoke rising from downtown. Fires were burning unchecked, likely started by desperate people trying to stay warm or by conflicts over resources. The entire skyline was hazy with ash and smoke. Looking at it, I knew with certainty that organized relief wasn't coming. We were truly on our own, and the raiders moving systematically through our neighborhood were just the beginning of the challenges we would face. The hospital expedition was nearly fatal. The building had been heavily looted, but not abandoned. A group had fortified the pharmacy area, and they were immediately hostile. We were pinned down in the emergency room by gunfire until Emily did something incredible. She stepped out with her hands raised, calling out medical terminology and explaining Mrs. Abernathy's symptoms. The shooting stopped. Their leader was a nursing student who had been on shift when the eruption happened. She reluctantly allowed Emily to enter the pharmacy alone to select the medications we needed. In exchange, I promised a portion of our next hydroponics harvest and technical assistance with their own attempts at indoor growing. While negotiating, I noticed something concerning. Many of the hospital group appeared malnourished, but some had strange gray-blue discoloration on their skin. When I asked about it, the nursing student became evasive. Later, Emily explained they were suffering from silver poisoning from ingesting colloidal silver as a desperate immune booster. They were slowly poisoning themselves. We left with the needed medications, but also with vital information. Desperation was creating new dangers beyond cold and hunger. People were taking extreme measures, consuming inappropriate substances, and making decisions that would have long-term health consequences. The problems would compound as time went on. When we returned to our building, we found Mr. Carter and Max had reinforced our defenses considerably. They had constructed barricades at stairwells using furniture and created defensive positions with clear sight lines. Their initiative impressed me. By day 20, we could observe the raiders' progress from our windows. They were methodical, clearing 2 to 3 buildings a day. We watched them drag people out, some resisting, others seemingly willing to join them. Those who fought back were subdued brutally. "They're building an army," Ray observed, "taking the strong and leaving the weak." I accelerated our preparations. We moved the most vulnerable members of our group, Mrs. Abernathy and the younger Carter child, into the hidden maintenance tunnel, along with enough supplies to last a week. I disguised our main hydroponics setup to look like random debris while setting up a decoy system that appeared more sophisticated than it was. Ray designed a series of defensive positions that would allow us to fall back systematically if breached. We created noise traps and tripwires throughout the building, giving us early warning and slowing any invasion. Everyone received specific assignments and rendezvous points if we became separated. The waiting was the worst part. Day 21 brought the raiders to the building directly across from ours. We watched through covered windows as they executed their now familiar pattern. First, scouts examined the exterior. Then, a small team entered to assess resistance. Finally, the main force moved in to clear and loot. We observed 6 people being led from that building. 2 elderly residents were simply left on the street. We waited until the raiders moved on before Ray and Mr. Carter risked retrieving them. One had already died from exposure, but the other survived. He introduced himself as Professor Williams from Northwestern University's Geology Department. His insights into the eruption and its likely duration were sobering. He estimated at least 6 months of severe volcanic winter, possibly longer. Day 22 arrived with tense anticipation. The raiders would reach our building today. At dawn, we implemented our final preparations. Everyone took positions according to our plan. I was stationed near our hydroponics system, prepared to defend our most valuable resource. The attack came at mid-morning. They were more cautious than we expected, perhaps warned by the obvious preparations we'd made to the building's exterior. The first wave triggered several of our alarms but retreated before engaging directly. The second attempt was more determined. They breached our first-floor barricade using a battering ram fashioned from a telephone pole. Ray's tripwires slowed them, but they adjusted quickly, cutting the wires and moving forward systematically. Our first confrontation occurred in the main lobby. Ray and Mr. Carter engaged them with improvised weapons, while Emily and I provided covering fire with the only actual firearm we possessed, a small revolver with limited ammunition. We were outnumbered, but had the advantage of knowing the terrain. The fighting was chaotic. I took a blow to the shoulder that sent searing pain down my arm. Despite the injury, I managed to help Ray retreat to our secondary position on the second floor. Mr. Carter wasn't as fortunate. He suffered a deep leg wound and was unable to move quickly enough. The raiders captured him. We fell back according to plan, but the raiders proved more adaptable than anticipated. They split their forces, sending teams to flank us through the building's back entrances. We were being herded toward our final defensive position, the basement. As we retreated, I caught glimpses of their operation. They were well equipped with both weapons and cold-weather gear. Some wore matching armbands, suggesting a level of organization beyond mere opportunism. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated conquest. Our final stand came at the basement entrance. Emily, Ray, and I held the narrow stairwell, using the confined space to our advantage. The raiders pressed forward relentlessly. During a momentary pause in the assault, their leader called out an offer: join them or die. They had food, power, and protection. All we needed to do was surrender our supplies and skills. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Trade one form of precarious survival for another, under the control of people who had just wounded and captured one of our own. The offer only strengthened our resolve. The fighting resumed with greater intensity. I took another hit, this time to my side. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline kept me functional. Ray was bleeding from a head wound, but still fighting effectively. Emily showed remarkable composure, using her smaller size to strike from unexpected angles. When it seemed we couldn't hold any longer, Professor Williams emerged from hiding with an unexpected weapon, a pressurized canister of chemicals from his university laboratory. He had kept it as a last resort. The makeshift chemical weapon disoriented the raiders long enough for us to retreat to our final fallback position, the hidden maintenance tunnel. We sealed the entrance behind us and waited in tense silence. The raiders ransacked the basement, discovering our decoy hydroponic system. They seemed satisfied with this find and eventually departed, taking Mr. Carter with them. We remained hidden for hours, listening as they stripped our building of valuable resources. The injury to my side was worse than I initially thought. I was losing blood steadily. Emily did her best to treat the wound using our limited medical supplies, but I needed proper care. Mrs. Abernathy prepared a poultice from her medicinal plants that helped control the bleeding, but the pain remained intense. When we finally emerged from hiding the next day, our building had been thoroughly looted. The raiders had taken most of our visible food supplies, all our tools, and anything else of obvious value. But our strategy had worked. They missed our real hydroponics system and our most carefully hidden supply caches. The next 2 days were focused on recovery. Mr. Carter's absence left a hole in our group. The youngest Carter child cried constantly for her father. Mrs. Carter alternated between grief and determination, sometimes breaking down in tears, other times working with fierce intensity on rebuilding our defenses. My wound developed an infection despite our best efforts. By day 25, I was feverish and weak. Mrs. Abernathy took charge of my care, using her knowledge of herbal medicine to create treatments when our pharmaceutical options were exhausted. The pain was nearly unbearable, but I refused to take our strongest painkillers knowing others might need them more. During my fevered state, I recalled a similar wound I'd suffered in Nigeria after a hydroponics installation was caught in the crossfire between militant groups. A local healer had treated me with a mixture of honey and specific herbs. I described the treatment to Mrs. Abernathy, who recreated it as best she could with available materials. Within hours, the infection began to recede. As I recovered, Ray and Professor Williams worked on reinforcing our new, more compact living space. We had lost significant territory but gained valuable knowledge about our adversaries. They weren't just taking supplies, they were recruiting. Mr. Carter's technical skills made him valuable enough to keep alive. This suggested a larger operation somewhere, perhaps gathering specialists to build something sustainable. By the end of day 25, I was well enough to help assess our situation. Despite heavy losses, our core assets remained. The hidden hydroponics system, Mrs. Abernathy's botanical knowledge, and our collective will to survive. We began rebuilding with a new understanding of the threats we faced. Recovery continued through day 26, with each of us taking on additional responsibilities to compensate for Mr. Carter's absence. Professor Williams proved unexpectedly valuable. His understanding of geological events gave us insight into what we were facing and might expect in the coming months. More practically, his knowledge of chemistry helped us create better filters for our water purification system. While inventorying what remained of our supplies, I discovered something unexpected in the rubble of our looted common area, an old ham radio that must have belonged to one of the building's former residents. It was damaged but potentially repairable. I had basic knowledge of electronics from my engineering background, enough to assess that we needed certain components to make it functional. If we could repair this, I told the others, showing them the radio, we might pick up transmissions from other survivors. Maybe even government broadcasts if any emergency systems are still operating. The possibility of connecting with the wider world energized everyone. We organized an expedition to search for electronic components in nearby buildings. Ray was still recovering from his injuries, so Emily volunteered to accompany me. Mrs. Carter initially objected, wanting to protect her remaining family, but Emily's knowledge of electronics from her high school robotics club made her the logical choice. We ventured out cautiously, moving from building to building while avoiding open streets. The raiders had moved on, but other dangers remained. The cold alone could kill us if we stayed exposed too long. We wore multiple layers and limited our time outside to short sprints between structures. In an apartment 3 buildings away, we found our first useful components: a shortwave radio with parts we could salvage. As Emily carefully removed what we needed, I searched the rest of the apartment. In a desk drawer, I found a journal with recent entries. The last one, dated just 2 weeks earlier, mentioned military aircraft flying over the city and rumors of relief centers being established at major sports venues. This was our first hint that organized response efforts might exist. We continued our search with renewed purpose, collecting more components and information. In another building, we found flyers that must have been airdropped, providing instructions for reaching an aid station at Soldier Field. The flyers were dated only 10 days earlier. When we returned with our findings, the group gathered for a serious discussion. The aid station information was tantalizing, but also potentially dangerous. It could be a trap set by raiders, or it could be legitimate but already overrun. Even if genuine, reaching Soldier Field would mean a journey of several miles through frozen, dangerous terrain. Professor Williams and Ray were skeptical, arguing that we should focus on strengthening our position. Mrs. Carter was torn, desperate to find help, but afraid of the risks. Mrs. Abernathy remained quiet throughout the debate, but I noticed her breathing had become labored again. The decision was temporarily postponed when Mrs. Abernathy collapsed that evening. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. The medication we had obtained from the hospital was helping, but she needed more specialized care than we could provide. At 76, with a respiratory condition in these harsh conditions, her situation was grave. I worked through the night to repair the radio, hoping to find information that might help us. By morning, I had it functioning well enough to scan frequencies. For hours, we heard nothing but static. Then, just as I was about to give up, we caught a fragmentary transmission, a repeating message about evacuation procedures and aid stations. The transmission confirmed that Soldier Field was indeed an active relief center. Mrs. Abernathy's condition forced our hand. By day 28, she was feverish and struggling to breathe. We needed to get her medical attention, which meant attempting the journey to Soldier Field. The problem was who would go and who would stay. I faced an agonizing choice. As the only one with the technical knowledge to maintain our hydroponics system, my departure could jeopardize our food supply. But my experience in disaster zones made me the most qualified to navigate the dangerous city and negotiate at the aid station. After much deliberation, I decided to join the expedition while leaving detailed instructions for Emily, who had shown aptitude for the technical aspects of our operation. Ray would lead the group staying behind, with Professor Williams providing additional support. Mrs. Carter, Emily, and I would take Mrs. Abernathy to the aid station, while Max would remain with Ray and the professor. The separation of the family was painful, but Mrs. Carter insisted on coming to help with Mrs. Abernathy and to search for her husband, who might have been taken to a central location by the raiders. We constructed a sled to transport Mrs. Abernathy, using salvaged materials and plastic sheeting to protect her from the elements. Each of us carried only essential supplies: food, water, medical items, and minimal personal belongings. I brought documentation of our hydroponic system, hoping it might prove valuable as evidence of our skills. The morning of day 29, we set out. The city was transformed into an alien landscape. Buildings stood like dark monoliths against the gray sky. Snow and ash created strange formations on abandoned vehicles and street furniture. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional distant sound of collapsing structures or our own breathing. We moved cautiously, following a route I had planned using the least exposed paths. Every intersection required careful reconnaissance before crossing. Twice we had to hide from groups moving through the streets, once raiders, once what appeared to be other refugees. By midday, Mrs. Abernathy's condition worsened. We took shelter in an abandoned store to rest and warm ourselves. While Mrs. Carter tended to Mrs. Abernathy, Emily and I scouted ahead. What we found changed everything. 3 blocks from our position, we encountered a military checkpoint. Soldiers in winter gear were screening people entering a secured perimeter. Beyond them, we could see vehicles and equipment bearing government insignia. Relief efforts were real, and closer than we had anticipated. We returned to Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Abernathy with the news. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of genuine hope. We carefully approached the checkpoint, hands visible, moving slowly. The soldiers were initially suspicious but quickly shifted to assistance mode when they saw Mrs. Abernathy's condition. Within minutes, medics were attending to her. The processing was efficient but thorough. We were screened for weapons, questioned about our backgrounds and skills, and given medical evaluations. When I explained my hydroponics work and showed documentation of our system, the commanding officer became particularly interested. "We have evacuation transports to the Midwest Emergency Agricultural Center," he explained. "They are specifically looking for people with your expertise. The government is establishing underground growing facilities to address food shortages during the volcanic winter." Mrs. Abernathy was immediately transported to a field hospital. The prognosis was cautiously positive. They had better medications and oxygen. Mrs. Carter was registered in the system that tracked separated families. They had no record of her husband yet, but the database was updated daily as new refugees arrived. We were given the option to evacuate immediately to the agricultural center or return to our building to retrieve our group and salvage our hydroponics equipment. The choice was clear. We needed to go back for the others. The military provided us with proper cold weather gear, communications equipment, and an escort of 2 soldiers to help transport people and equipment. The return journey was remarkably different with adequate clothing and the security of armed escorts. Day 30 dawned with renewed purpose. We reached our building and found Ray, Professor Williams, and Max safe. The reunion was emotional, especially between Mrs. Carter and her son. We quickly explained the situation and began packing essential equipment from our hydroponics system. The soldiers helped dismantle and transport our most valuable components. One of them, a specialist with engineering background, was visibly impressed by what we had constructed with limited resources. "This is exactly what the Agricultural Center needs," he told me. "Practical solutions developed under real constraints." As we prepared to leave, I took one final look at the space that had been our sanctuary for the past month. Despite the raids, the cold, and the incredible hardship, we had survived. More than that, we had created something that would continue to have value in this changed world. By mid-afternoon, we were all processed through the checkpoint. Mrs. Abernathy was stabilized and approved for transport to the agricultural center along with the rest of us. The seeds I had collected from around the world, which I had carefully protected through everything, were documented and sealed for transport. They represented genetic diversity that might prove crucial in the coming years. Before boarding the transport vehicle, I asked one of the officers about long-term prospects. His answer was measured, but not without hope. "The ash will settle eventually. The scientists are working on acceleration methods. It won't be quick, but civilization hasn't collapsed. It's just adapted. People like you, with practical skills and the determination to use them, are how we'll get through this." As our transport moved through the secured perimeter toward the evacuation point, I reflected on what we had endured and what lay ahead. The volcanic winter would continue for months, perhaps years. Recovery would be slow and uneven, but humans are remarkably adaptable, especially when we work together. The hydroponic systems I designed before the eruption were meant for urban environments with limited space. Now they would be repurposed for a world with limited sunlight. My expertise had evolved from a specialized professional skill to a survival necessity to, finally, a building block for reconstruction. Looking at our group, Mrs. Abernathy with her botanical wisdom, Professor Williams with his scientific knowledge, the Carter family with their resilience, and Ray with his tactical thinking, I saw a microcosm of what would rebuild society. Different skills, different perspectives, united by the will to survive and create rather than merely consume. The first 30 days had been about immediate survival. The next 30 would be about building something sustainable. And perhaps, in the months and years beyond, we would be part of creating a society more conscious of its fragility and more committed to cooperation than the one we had lost when darkness fell.